So I watched an interesting video on Itauma and I wanted to give the boxing philosophy perspective. So let's open that door and explore some ideas. So the first idea is that Usyk pointed at one name on the screen in Saudi Arabia, and that was Itauma. All he kept pointing to was Itauma. So when the man who beat everyone picks you out of a wall of heavyweights, it's not a compliment, or it's not just a compliment, it's a coronation. So in figurative terms, Usyk is the man. So when the man says you're the next one, that's powerful. And the context here is the man represents being the best. But on a deeper level, there's, I guess, a psychological form of pressure. But at the same time, it's admiration and it's credibility. And think of this, it's credibility from the most credible. And the question will emerge, is this like a passing of the torch? Is Usyk passing that torch to Itauma? Let's not forget, and hopefully Moses doesn't forget, that he has a lot to do before he can be considered elite. But elite fighters, they see the elite in him, or the potential elite in him. But ultimately, Itauma needs to focus on what happens in the ring. This, of course, and let's flip the coin, may motivate Filip Hrgović even further. What Hrgović are we going to get this Saturday? That's a really good question. And it should be one that is prepared, motivated, and ready to shock the boxing world and the boxing ecosystem. And in a sense, recognition creates pressure, but ultimately, reputation means nothing. It means nothing when the bell rings. And then the next idea here is that nobody asked that of Mike Tyson in 1986, 20 years old, who went straight through Trevor Berbick like a hot knife through butter. And the world just said, more, give us more. Why does the same dominance get cheered in one era and doubted in another? So that's the perspective. And I would argue, is that perspective or is that premise true? Did Mike Tyson not have critics? Or did he silence them with total domination? Trevor Berbick, let's remember, and I say this respectfully, was not an elite champion, but he was a champion and he came to fight. He stylistically, perhaps, fought the wrong fight. And that left hook from Mike Tyson was absolutely vicious. The Trevor Berbick knockout from that left hook to the temple, that short left hook to the temple, was a viral moment in boxing history. It was viral before the term viral was created. Think of that. And I say that Trevor Berbick fought the wrong fight, but I don't think it would have mattered that night because Mike Tyson was really on his A game. Now, even if the premise is true or the premise is untrue, many people enjoy being overly critical of Itauma. Think of this, in an imperfect world, you can't have a perfect performance. So if that's your only standard, there will always be harsh criticism. And when I look at criticism, I ask whether the source is valid, is the source credible, and is it coming from a good place? For example, the criticism of Ben Davidson, the trainer, seems totally unwarranted. Yet in the YouTube universe, this is a common perspective, even though Ben Davidson is objectively a good trainer. So here is a perspective. You may have a strong opinion, but does your opinion matter? Are you a casual fan? Or do you try to understand the nuances of boxing? Or are you simply just hating for the sake of hating? So I understand that a lot of people are critical of Itauma, but that doesn't mean that their criticisms are valid. So in a sense, when I look at someone's criticism of Itauma, I look at the process of how they get to that criticism, and that to me can validate if that criticism is worth listening to. And in a sense, criticism only has value when it carries context, knowledge, and credibility. Now, before I go into the next idea, don't forget to download my free chapter from my boxing book. Now, just check the pinned comment below, download the free chapter, and enjoy. Now, let's get back to the next idea. So, the next idea is we need him to go a few rounds. This is the exact phrase, and this phrase actually came from Spencer Oliver. And he states that it does my head in. Do you not think he's being tested in the gym? So there's this consensus that he hasn't gone a few rounds, and there's criticism amongst that. And what Spencer Oliver is saying, well, you know what? Even though he may not be tested in the ring, he will be tested in preparation. He'll be tested in the gym. He'll be tested in sparring, etc. And again, this goes back to this whole thing about certain fans, judging harshly. And it's funny how some exact different standards on others than they do themselves. Harsh criticism to Moses Itauma, I guess, is not personal. It's just sometimes it can be a particular human trait of certain people, but some judge harshly because they're jealous, others out of a lack of awareness. But it's fair to ask, what will happen if Moses Itauma goes into the second half of a fight? That is a genuine question. That doesn't come from a bad place. And then the next question is, can Hrgović take Moses Itauma into the second half of the fight? Because if Moses Itauma is able to destroy Hrgović inside 3 rounds, inside 5 rounds, that will be an absolutely huge statement. Because Filip Hrgović has credibility, and he only has one loss to Daniel Dubois, who is a 2-time heavyweight champion. So the unanswered questions in this context, they are legitimate, but a fighter can only answer the tests his opponents are capable of giving him. So it's important to remember that. And then the next idea is that the proof is in the names that he's flattened. Now, Whyte was put in there to give him rounds and also to give him a test. I remember online, there were some people that were saying that Whyte was going to win that fight. And Whyte came into that fight with even if you would argue that Whyte is not world class or isn't currently world class, he did in his prime have a world class counter left hook. And despite this, Moses Itauma gave a fantastic performance. And of course, there's some context here. Or not of course, but there is some context here. It was a great performance. But was it a great Whyte? And that's a reasonable question. There were rumours of an injury with regards to Whyte. I wasn't able to clarify if that was true, but there were rumours. Despite this, the performance was impeccable. Remember, Moses Itauma is not responsible for the injury of his opponent. And the performance against Franklin was also a great performance. Franklin had ambition, durability, and he had good ring IQ. Franklin also had a good resume. He went the distance with Whyte, and he went the distance with AJ. Yet he was completely overwhelmed by Moses Itauma. And that uppercut was absolutely chilling. Mike Tyson would have been proud of that uppercut. Going back to Mike Tyson, I remember when he used to throw the right hook to the body, and then he would throw the right uppercut to the head, and he was so vicious with it, really vicious with it. And it's important to remember that context can reduce the size of the victory, but it should not erase the quality of the performance. And then the next idea is the second is the first loser. What does it mean? Well, nobody's calling it a sprint this time. The panel's fear, or real fear, isn't that Itauma loses to Hrgović, it's that Britain crowns him too early and jinxes it. That's an interesting observation. Why, if it's true, why is British boxing terrified of its own hype? And from my perspective, from an outsider looking in, Moses Itauma is a great talent. The question is, will the talent be utilized? Or will the talent, if his talent is like, let's say, a 9 out of 10, and let's say he has the talent of becoming an elite fighter, will he become that elite fighter? And of course, some may argue that he being Moses Itauma, he carries the pressure of the British media on his shoulders. And so far, Itauma seems to have very strong shoulders. He seems very stoic about it. And of course, Hrgović could provide a very serious challenge. But there is a question. There is a question mark over Hrgović, if we're honest. For example, to my knowledge, his trainer has his trainer been confirmed? Remember, Filip Hrgović had a good performance against David Allen. There's no doubt about that. But he turned up to that fight without a trainer. But let's clarify something. Itauma's potential, again from my perspective and from the perspective of many others, is very, very real. He is not just a product of very good marketing. Yes, there has been good marketing, but there is potentially an elite fighter, and both of those things can be true. And it's important to remember that hype can exaggerate potential, but it cannot manufacture the ability we are already seeing in the ring. And then the next idea is that when you do those comparisons, people go, you can't rate Itauma like a young Mike Tyson. Well, according to Spencer, you can. It's about who's around in your era, not a time machine. I think people love Mike Tyson so much. Mike Tyson fans, they're so passionate and they're just so fond of Mike Tyson because of, those moments that he created, that you're never going to convince them that anyone is similar to Mike Tyson. But that doesn't mean that there isn't similarities in the rise. And again, it's really hard to qualify. Now, let's put something on the table. Mike Tyson was a great fighter. I don't think any of us are debating that. But the notion that he was in a strong era is debated. Hear me out. In his first reign, in the 80s, some would say that era was particularly weak. And there's some political reasons for that we're not going to go into right now. But when he returned from prison in the 90s, there were some true heavy hitters. Riddick Bowe, great fighter. Lennox Lewis, great fighter. Vander Holyfield, legend, great fighter. And also you had other good fighters like Ray Mercer. Ray Mercer gave Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis all they could handle. David Tua, he had great power. Michael Moorer, another great champion. Tommy Morrison had a fantastic left hook, fantastic explosiveness. Sometimes I wonder, what would Tommy Morrison would have done in today's heavyweight landscape? I think he would have done really well. I think he would have done very well. How would Anthony Joshua have handled a Tommy Morrison? How would a Tyson Fury have handled a Tommy Morrison? How would a Dillian Whyte have handled a Tommy Morrison? How would a Derek Chisora have handled a Tommy Morrison? I think the 90s division was very, very strong. So Tyson's dominance in the 80s, you could argue, was not a strong era, but Mike Tyson was definitely a great fighter. And in a sense, greatness should be judged within its own environment. History provides comparison, not identical conditions. So in a sense, the weak era of the 80s is not the fault or the responsibility of Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson was simply elite. There was Mike Tyson and then there was the rest. At the moment, when we look at Moses Itauma, there seems to be Moses Itauma and the rest. But will it continue to be like that? Will he have an era of dominance? Will he become champion? Only time will tell. And then the next idea is that boxing needs a passing of the baton, and it needs another superstar. AJ and Fury pulled British boxing to another level, but they're past it now. Is Itauma the first genuine heir, or just the next name on the treadmill? Now, let's not forget Daniel Dubois. Let's put some respect on his name. Daniel Dubois is a two-time heavyweight champion, and that's highly an amazing achievement. He was articulate and vicious against Fabio Wardley. And let's not forget that Fabio Wardley was also a champion. And he's pending a rematch with Daniel Dubois. The first fight was spectacular, and I wonder how the rematch is going to go. But the point is that the British landscape is thriving. It's growing exponentially. It's absolutely thriving. And Tyson Fury and AJ, they opened the door for British heavyweights in this era. Lennox Lewis was possibly the greatest British heavyweight of all time, maybe the greatest British fighter of all time. And British heavyweight boxing is lucrative. It's extremely lucrative. There is money, there is fame, and there is a community. And the baton is rarely passed to one man. Sometimes an entire generation walks through the door created by the last one. So will the baton be passed? And if it is passed, maybe it's passed to a few people, not just one. But again, time will tell. And then the next idea, and we're pivoting here, is that AJ versus Fury is 95% going to America. Madison Square Garden, November the 20th. Eddie Hearn and AJ, they signed the contracts, but they signed the contracts for Wembley. But Turk Sports, TKO, Saudi, they want New York. Why do they want New York? Because of Netflix, because of the global audience, because of the timing. Economically, it makes sense. Well, economically, they both make sense, but maybe economically this makes more sense. And the question becomes, who really owns the biggest fight in British history? The fighters or the broadcasters? The owners? They are the investors, the people that put up the money. And in capitalism, the person with the biggest money has the biggest say. Culturally, I think the fight of AJ versus Tyson Fury, it belongs in Britain. Culturally, it belongs in Britain. But the economics will probably put it elsewhere. And I guess that's the strength of capitalism. And, you know, culture may decide where a fight belongs, but capital often decides where it happens. And then the next idea is that, you know, again, we're on this AJ Fury thing. AJ's counter is that I signed a contract for this. This is a quote from him. And so the fight isn't in danger, but the venue is. And that means renegotiating the money. So when a location change forces a contract to be rewritten, is it a venue dispute or a power struggle wearing a geography costume, figuratively speaking? The point is this. I'm not sure how this goes, but I'm assuming when you're doing contracts for fights that are worth millions, literally millions upon millions upon millions, there will be revisions. However, if a contract is signed for a particular place and then an investor comes in and then says that it's going to be somewhere else, I'm assuming there's going to be economic compensation for that change. And I'm assuming that when you have fights of this magnitude, where there's this much money on the table, that revising and redrafting is probably a normal it's probably a normal procedure. And in boxing, geography can become economics, and economics quickly becomes the power. And I guess that's why they say money talks. And then the final idea is that it's almost like a domino effect. Some would call it the London buses effect. One comes and then several comes. Wardley Dubois rematch. And then you got Itauma, and then you got AJ Fury. Every heavyweight fight is waiting on another. But the point is that these British heavyweight champions have come like buses. I remember Frank Bruno, and it took him 4 attempts to get that heavyweight title. And, you know, in a sense, the British heavyweight boxing scene is absolutely thriving. Because, you know, when you look at Frank Bruno was an absolute star in the British context. For example, when Frank Bruno fought Mike Tyson in the first fight, the UK viewership was 14.3 million. 14.3 million. And an additional 2 million people listened live on BBC Radio 2. So, in a sense, not only did boxing fans know about Frank Bruno, the whole of Britain knew about Frank Bruno and supported Frank Bruno. And the Frank Bruno that came before Lennox Lewis, it felt like that was the only heavyweight that the British public knew. But now we have several contenders, several champions, and they have captured not only the British public, but they have captured global attention. And like I said, many buses have come, and perhaps many more are coming. And perhaps Itauma is one of the most impressive buses to come. And in the end, British heavyweight boxing has always had stars. But today, there is not one bus coming. There is an entire fleet. So here are 8 questions to develop a better understanding of Moses Itauma. Question 1. Is Usyk's praise of Moses Itauma a passing of the torch or simply a recognition of exceptional potential? It could be both, but for the first one to be true, for it to be a passing of the torch, Moses Itauma needs to not only become the champion, he needs to become the undisputed champion. And only time will tell if he can become the undisputed champion. However, as things stand today, Moses Itauma has shown through the gym stories and through what he's done in the ring that he is an exceptional potential. So he's already established the second part of the question, but for him to figuratively be that passing of the torch, he has to have that dominance. And that could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years away. But there's so much potential with regards to Moses Itauma. Of course, there's some questions. How does he cope in the second half of the fight? What happens when he's presented more complicated questions or when he deals with more sophisticated fighters? How well does he take a punch to the head? How well does he take a punch to the body? There's a range of questions that still need to be answered before we can say that he is that guy. Question number 2, are critics judging Itauma too harshly because they expect perfection from a developing heavyweight? I think there's a human trait to judge people from a different stance from how we judge ourselves. So when we judge ourselves, we look at context and we look at nuance. When we judge other people, we might judge them from a perfect framework. And I think that the problem is with Moses Itauma is that people are being way too harsh. Like they're saying he hasn't fought anyone. That is not true. He fought Dillian Whyte. He fought Franklin. Both of those people had resumes. Both of those boxers had resumes. Dillian Whyte, even though he's past his best, had a world-class left hook counter, and he fought so many different fighters. He had a competitive fight with AJ. He beat Joseph Parker, a former world champion. He beat Povetkin. He has had a succession of fights with various people. And of course, Franklin went the distance with AJ. He went the distance with Dillian Whyte, and he would have had a massive incentive to do well in that fight, because had he had done well, he would have got bigger paydays. So I think that there is this community that is judging Moses Itauma very harshly, but I don't think this is independent of Moses Itauma. I think all fighters get judged harshly, from Shakur Stevenson to Floyd Mayweather to Joe Calzaghe to Rocky Marciano. There's always going to be naysayers. There's always going to be critics. I guess the question is, are their criticisms valid? And I guess you've got to look at the argument and where it's coming from to be able to make that decision. Question number 3. If Hrgović takes Itauma into the second half of the fight, what will we learn about Moses Itauma that we have not seen yet? Well, we'll see if he's able to retain his reflexes in the second half of the fight. We'll see if he's able to still be dominant in the second half of the fight. We might see some other tactical nuances from Moses Itauma. We might see some new punch variations. We might see him having to fight in the pocket. We might see his reaction to taking body shots, his reactions to taking an accumulation of punches, and we'll see how he downloads data as the fight progresses. So does he still have the clarity in round 1? Does he have that same clarity when he's in round 7, round 8, round 9, round 10? So potentially we could learn so much about Moses Itauma, but it depends on the context. If he's just beating up his opponent for 7, 8, 9 rounds, that's different from having a competitive affair where you're in the 7th round and it's 3 rounds apiece, or you're in the 7th round, you got knocked down in round 1. So there definitely is context. But yes, we can learn some new things about Moses Itauma. Also, does he carry his speed? Does he carry his reflexes? Does he carry his timing? And does he carry his power? And one of the major assets of Moses Itauma is his feet, his foot speed. Does he carry that speed in the second half of the fight? Question 4. How much context should we apply to Moses Itauma's wins over Dillian Whyte and Jermaine Franklin? Dillian Whyte, great performance. Allegedly, Dillian Whyte was injured. So we can acknowledge the impeccable performance, but also acknowledge the context. Jermaine Franklin, durable fighter, has experience of going 12 rounds with a former world champion and a former world-class contender, and he dismantled him in 5 rounds. That to me is a great performance. So, and he was unable to put Itauma under any considerable pressure. He did catch him with a few punches, but like they say, if you're going to go in the rain, you're going to get wet. But he wasn't able to put him under any sustained pressure or win a round or, really cause any great resistance. So we definitely get some very positive implications from that fight. There was no red flags. Question number 5. Is the Mike Tyson comparison useful, or does it create unnecessary pressure around Itauma? Well, first of all, Mike Tyson was orthodox. Itauma is a southpaw, so that's already a difference. And also they're different type of fighters. Mike Tyson was a vicious fighter. He was a tactical fighter, but he was a brutal, vicious fighter in his prime. I would say that Itauma is more of a tactical fighter, even though Tyson is a tactical fighter because he developed that custom-mata system, and early in his career, he relied predominantly on head movement, and he was just so vicious in the pocket. Itauma has a very different style, so there definitely is differences. The correlation is the dominance. That's the correlation. Mike Tyson dominated his opponents. Itauma is currently dominating his opponents. Is the pressure unnecessary? Well, it depends. Is Itauma carrying that pressure on his shoulders? His team should be working with him to enable him to deal with that pressure effectively. But pressure can cause psychological distress and it can hurt a fighter, but it depends how the fighter is processing that pressure. And the only person who probably knows how that pressure is affecting him is Itauma. But also, let's not forget that being compared to Mike Tyson is a beautiful compliment. Question number 6. Is Itauma really the next British heavyweight superstar, or is he part of a much deeper generation? We don't know. He could be the next British heavyweight superstar. He's shown the ingredients. He's shown that he has the ability, but there's still question marks, and we don't know how he handles adversity. You can be genetically a great fighter, but if you don't have the psychological makeup or the mental toughness, then you might not even become a champion. So we can't say he's the next British heavyweight superstar until we see him react effectively to adversity. And even though the ring is what Teddy Atlas calls the chamber of truth, we haven't seen that level of adversity to determine whether he has a strong mind state. It looks like he has a strong mindset, but we haven't had the complete clarification of that yet. But the implications are very, very good. Question number 7. Should AJ versus Fury remain in Britain for cultural reasons, or does the biggest investment deserve the biggest influence? I guess in a perfect world, where it's about the fans, where it's just about the fans, the fight remains in Britain because it's British fighters. The foundations of those fighters were built in Britain. The rivalry was harvested in Britain, and then it exploded exponentially. But it feels like it deserves to be in Britain. However, in capitalism, generally speaking, the person with the most money wins the argument, or the person with the most money determines, the person with the biggest slice of the pie determines where the fight will go. So I guess in this sense, if the rumors are true, capitalism wins. And finally, question 8. Is British heavyweight boxing entering another golden era, with Itauma simply the latest bus to arrive? Well, it is another era. Like I said before, Frank Bruno was a very recognizable and very popular fighter. It took him 4 attempts to get the title, and big respect, hats off to him. After that came Lennox Lewis, who was arguably the greatest British heavyweight boxer that we've ever seen. But then we had the Tyson and AJ generation, both becoming heavyweight champions, both becoming 2-time heavyweight champions. And now we have Daniel Dubois, a 2-time heavyweight champion. Wardley, a previous heavyweight champion. So in today's context, in today's contemporary times, there are many different British bosses that are collecting titles. And Mo Itauma is the latest boss to arrive. But like I said, that boss has the potential to be the most impressive. But we watch and we observe just to see how that journey goes and see if it can arrive at that destination. Quick announcement. I have a free chapter from my boxing book. So click the link below to visit the landing page and get your free chapter. Remember to check your spam/junk folder if you don't receive it. Also, let me know what you think. Constructive feedback is always welcome.